So, welcome to my shed. This is the third isolation project and I've finally got myself a proper workspace. The weather has improved massively, and so the geraniums, which spend their winter in the shed, have been allowed to come out. So I now have actual workspace, which makes life a lot easier. And it's still not huge. There's not a lot of space in here, but it's definitely easier than trying to do it all in either my tiny little office or on the kitchen table or on the little bench outside. So it's, yeah, much easier. So today's project is going to make a mobile hanger. So we have our baby due in anywhere between 6 and 10 weeks, if the 38 to 42 average, yes, 6 to 10 weeks. And we're starting to get everything all sorted out. So Emma bought a beautiful elephant mobile. And we were looking on, and she was looking, I don't know where she looked, but Etsy and various things, and trying to find a mobile hanger. They're really expensive for what is essentially a few blocks of wood. Admittedly, I suspect in getting everything that I need for this. Actually, no, I haven't spent that much, because almost all of the wood was reclaimed kindling from Emma's work, where she works for a cabinet maker, so it was all offcuts of wood. So we've spent a bit on the dowel, and otherwise it's just the same tools that I had here. So let's get on with it. And I'll talk you through my process. I'll talk you through the mistakes I make, because we all know I'm going to make mistakes, and we'll see what I come up with at the end. So I designed my mobile holder with two parts. Essentially, there was a clamp at the bottom half which would hold everything to the crib, and then there was the dowel-based top section which would then hold the mobile itself. I decided to start with the clamp at the bottom, so I took two large offcuts of oak. I decided to make mine stretch across 3 bars of the crib walls, sides, never quite sure what to call them. Walls sounds a little bit mean and a little bit like a prison. So I took these offcuts and planed them relatively flat, created a bit of a chamfer on the edges and cut them all to size. I then had a third small section which was going to go onto the back, which would actually clamp the dowel. And the plan was that the 3 of them would work together to clamp the sides and the dowel and give me some adjustability. Because one of the things that I wanted in my mobile holder was the ability to be able to either make it higher or lower or turn it. I glued some cork to the inside edges of these oak sections so that there would be no risk of any marks or pressure on the crib bars. And then I set around making an octagon. I decided that my design I wanted for the dowel support was an octagon, and it turns out it's a little bit more complicated than I'd initially thought. So this was my first attempt. I thought I'd marked it out reasonably sensibly and got everything lined up. And then by the time I'd actually cut everything to shape, I realized that everything was a little bit on the wonk. None of it was quite square, none of it was quite flat. I tried to fix it with sanding and filing to be able to reshape some of the edges, and just looking at it realized no, it definitely wasn't going to work. So I decided to start again, and initially started just by actually making sure I had a really nice square and flat piece of wood. My original piece of wood actually was slightly tapered, and I think that was part of what threw everything off. So I then actually properly marked everything up with segments and making sure I was marking on the side so that when I was cutting things, I could actually follow the lines on both sides and make sure that everything was square. This would have been so much easier with a bandsaw or anything that allows me to be able to put the piece of wood flat on a platen initially. But here you can see me actually drawing out the sides and marking all the way around the sides so that everything was properly marked. I then started cutting all the edges off. And actually, I think at the end, the octagon I got was a significantly better shape than the original one. I'll leave you to make that decision. Once all the cork had glued onto the oak panels, I cut the edges off, gave them a little bit of a chamfer, and then started on actually finishing these pieces. So I wanted to chamfer the edges, make sure there was nothing sharp, make sure there were no sharp edges that the baby could injure themselves on. I used a file here just to be able to create nice square chamfers and smoothed off the edge. There was a tiny bit of glue on there that I just wanted to make sure wasn't going to show up. But yeah, lovely bits of oak actually. It was really nice to be able to work with these. So worked my way around all three sections of the clamp just to make sure that everything was going to be finished off evenly, make sure that everything had the same chamfers and looked good. I have to say it was a much nicer experience actually working in the shed where I had a proper work surface. I had a place that I could store all my tools. This process took about 3 days in total, not this part of the process. This bit took probably about an hour, but the whole process of building everything with gluing took about 3 days, so it was nice that I wasn't invading any other space. So yeah, shed is a good thing. And that's my completed clamp, well, semi-completed clamp. Those are the 3 bits that I'm going to use to clamp around the bars and then around the dowel. So I then completed my chamfers on the octagon, made sure that all the edges were nice and flat, sanded it, and also had to make sure I got rid of any of the marks that I'd made on it for the actual cutting and the shaping. So again, I wanted to make sure it just matched in with the rest of the wood. What was really nice about this was actually it's a really nice piece of end grain. So actually I think it's finished up really nicely. You can see the cross grain there in the side, and so you had a really nice bit of grain running across the faces, which yeah, should look really good. And then this was a middle section. Initially I was just going to use one piece of dowel for the height and one for the arm, then realised actually to be able to make sure it was high enough, we're using a cot top changing mat because we don't have a lot of space in our room for an additional changing table. And so we wanted to have the mobile so it was high enough that we can use on the cot top changing mat and then also when she's in the crib. So I wanted to make sure I could put 2 pieces of dowel. So this piece that I'm making now is an extender, so I can actually glue the dowel between the 2 sections. So these are all my pieces finished and shaped. You can see the chamfered edges and everything looking smooth and clean and nice. I then realised the only piece I hadn't made was actually something to hang the mobile off. So this was me just cutting a square piece that I can then put a hook in to be able to actually hang the mobile at the end. I ummed and ahed about maybe just putting a notch into the top piece of dowel, but I'm quite pleased that I did this. Again, just chamfered all the edges off and made sure that I had something to be able to work with. I then realised I wanted a nice flat edge for the dowel to go into at a 45-degree angle, so once I've finished all of this, I then mounted one piece facing up and just flattened that side off so I had at least a centimetre width that I could then drill into to be able to put the dowel into so that it all looks square and nice and lovely. I don't think I'd quite worked out where the camera was at this point, so unfortunately, as I'm doing the drilling, I'm completely in the way. And there we are, that's my end piece. So I made a slight mistake here. I drilled through the 3 pieces, and on the second drill I'd forgotten to actually secure where the first hole was. So what I very quickly realised was when I tried to put the 2 screws through, the second one didn't quite line up. So I then remembered to put the screw through for the first one and then actually put it through the other one. So they now all lined up. It has meant I've got a slightly wonky hole on the very back piece, but hopefully it's not something that will be obvious. It will never be seen by anybody. I then used a countersink just to be able to create a nicer edge on all the holes. The coach bolts that I'm using to hold everything together have a square edge on them to be able to make sure that everything is going to lock in place, I guess. I hadn't quite counted for that, so I'm then using a chisel just to cut out a square countersink. So having drilled my countersink holes, I realised I needed to do a square countersink so that everything will sit flat. My chiseling is not my strongest ability, but it worked out in the end.
There were a few small burrs just on top of the coach bolt, so I just wanted to make sure that everything was nicely smooth and finished. There we are, that's the clamp together, wing nuts on, everything holds together nicely. Then needed to create my hole for the dowel, so again, this would have been so much more simple with a pillar drill. Actually worked really well. I just clamped it all together like that and drilled a hole directly down where I needed it to. It is slightly off center, slightly on the skew, but actually in the final piece, you don't really notice it. Making sure that everything goes together and everything still clamps together nicely. Using a round file there just to make sure that that hole for the dowel is smooth and straight, and make sure that everything is going to be adjustable the way that I wanted it to. So this is my joining section. I decided initially to try drilling with the large piece and then realised that drilling through the grain was actually much harder work than it should be. So I decided to go from small to large. There was actually quite a puff of smoke when I realised I was slightly overheating it initially. So drilled a hole all the way through. Again, with a pillar drill, it would be far easier to get it completely straight. My hole was not 100% straight on this, but it's not so bad that you'd really notice. I was struggling to get the dowel through. The dowel is 9mm. I had a drill bit that was 8mm and I had a drill bit that was 10mm. So I decided to drill through at 8mm initially and try and make it larger, and that was just taking a bit too much time, so I decided to do it at 10mm, and that's made it a bit loose, but with the glue it's all worked in the end. Tidy workspace is a good workspace, so I gave everything a good hoover and then mixed up my epoxy with a bit of sawdust because I knew I had a bit of space to fill, and then glued everything in place, making sure to lift the ends slightly so everything glued nice and flat. Trying to tidy up all the epoxy from the end, so I've then got less cleaning up at the end to need to do. Then had the same job to do on the octagon. I was using the second octagon behind it, A, for visual reference, and B, to prevent tear out when I then got the drill bit all the way through. So again, I was using smaller to larger drill bits. I'm using the drill bits there as a measure guide just to actually see whether I am getting things completely straight. This is a trick that I've actually learnt through dental implant surgery rather than any sort of woodworking. I'm sure it works in both cases. I decided not to go oversized on this hole because it had annoyed me so much on the dowel connector. So I decided to take some time to work with the file just to enlarge that hole enough that the dowel will fit through it with a slight resistance fit. This took longer than I would have ideally liked, just taking that time to file away at the inside, but thankfully it looks less ridiculous in fast motion than it did at regular speed. Then I had to drill the second hole, so I decided I was going to create a double join in this piece of wood. That doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment, but you'll see exactly what I mean at the end. So drilling my second hole was probably easier than the first because I'd learnt a few lessons already. There was then the slightly annoying task of having to file the hole large enough to be able to get the second piece of dowel through, which I knew was coming, and it's always nice to have a job that you're not looking forward to looming over you. So having got everything filed and sorted out, tidy up, lots of sorting out, just making sure that everything was looking good, I countersunk the holes just to make sure that everything was going to fit up nicely. Got everything cleaned for gluing. And then got the first piece glued. So my plan was, and still is, I guess, to glue the first piece in and then re-drill through that dowel, because I just felt that it gave it a nice aesthetic at the end. So I'm just drilling through that bit of dowel just to make sure that I can then stick the second bit through. I managed to make a slight error here. I got the dowel in and then it probably got stuck stuck, which was a mild panic for a moment, just trying to pull it out using the vise and nothing was working. Having a bit of a worry, eventually decided to drill out that top piece of dowel. So drilled through the dowel and thankfully everything came out nicely. I then had to cut off the bit that I'd obviously just drilled through, refile it and then check the fit. So thankfully all fitting a lot better, and then gluing the second part in once I'd tidied everything up. Here you can see what I mean about that double joint. I know it's a complete nonsense because actually only one of those pieces of dowel is actually complete, but I quite like the design. Decided to do a quick test fit just to see that it would actually work. I think I would have been quite irritated if it hadn't at this point. It's not going to go on that side of the crib in the end, but it just made it easy enough to be able to see. Yeah, basically it works. I hadn't actually put a screw on the top section at this point, so every time I put it up, it kept falling off, which was a little bit annoying, but it demonstrated that it worked. Emma seemed to approve. So I then had some final finishing off bits and pieces. I just wanted to make sure that all the edges were nice and smooth, wanted to make sure that dowel section was good and clean, wanted to make sure there was no epoxy left anywhere on any of the joins, so when I oiled it and painted it, everything would look smooth and clean and oil up beautifully and not end up with big epoxy lumps on. So I was using a little needle file just to make sure that everything was completely polished and clean. Also just gave the ends of the dowels just a very slight chamfer so that they looked finished. I think that's part of what I enjoy doing, is just getting those finishing details just sorted out. Emma decided that the plain wood looked a little bit oversimplistic. I think that's probably the easiest way to put it. So she decided she wanted to help with it as well, and I think it's turned out beautifully. She is looking rather pregnant in this shot. So she masked off all the wood that I was going to oil up later, and then used chalk paint just to be able to paint the dowels. We decided that the wood that I'd used for all the joints was actually lovely wood, and therefore we didn't want to, no idea what I'm showing her there. We didn't want to paint that wood, but the dowels are just very simple beech dowels. So we just painted all of them a beautiful sort of turquoisey colour, which is a theme that runs throughout the mobile and actually throughout the nursery generally. Very carefully painting things, making sure she doesn't make my job any more difficult at the end. She's very detail orientated. So I then used tung oil just to be able to oil up all the bits of oak that I had. Just give it a nice matte finish, and it also just brings out that grain beautifully. It just, yeah, it looks nice. Once you've used the chalk paint, you then need to wax it. So Emma then put the wax onto all the paint, which protects everything. And then she polished everything up just to make sure it was all nice and clean and ready for me to oil the wooden sections on here. That end grain came up really beautifully actually. I was so pleased with how well that came up once it had been oiled. And actually that middle section, although it wasn't part of the original design, I think works quite well. So, final fit up. So I had to put it on the far side about halfway down, so it should be able to turn to one side to use for the changing mat, and then rotate to the other side for over the crib in the long run. There we are, the final piece. And we even painted the ends of the coach bolts just to make it look a little bit more friendly. But yeah, completely over-engineered, but for a beautiful mobile. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If there's any questions that you'd like me to answer, please let me know. But otherwise, please subscribe if you'd like to, like the video if you'd like to, and thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.